There you go. It was a lot of years ago. Okay. After many delays, let's see. Well, I'll wait till we get the heads up.
Is the starting time now officially 8:30?
It is 8:30, which it should be any second now. I'm going to wait till it's 8:30 and then I'll just start talking, whatever the computer says. 8:30. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back after many absences to Wednesday morning Torah, which used to be Thursday morning Torah, but is now Wednesday morning Torah. So since we have missed so much, even though this morning's Parsha is Vayishlach, we're going to talk in general about the family nature of the book of Genesis. And then we'll get to a little bit about Vayishlach, but I'm going to start with a sort of survey, beginning with the fact that after starting at about the 12th chapter of Genesis, this book, which begins with the creation of the world, then moves to the creation of the family. And that's not an obvious beginning to the saga that is supposed to tell the story of God's place in the human carnival. And yet, from another point of view, of course, it makes perfect sense, because what the dynamic of Genesis, just to remind you, is one of increasing specificity. Before then, in Exodus, you have one of increasing universality, by which I mean God starts with the cosmos, creates the world. Then the camera starts gradually to get more and more specific. Creates the world, creates the animals, creates the human being. And for a minute, the camera is extremely specific because there are only two people that it's dealing with. But even after that, it's still fairly universal because you're dealing with the human family. And so you have the creation of all these various human activities and implements like music and so on. And God's interaction is still with the entire human world. After the flood, the Tower of Babel, and the choice of Abraham, God's activity that we read about anyway, I don't know what God was doing in China, for example, at the time, but at least the activity that we read about is God's interaction with a specific family, not even with a people, because they're not a people yet, but God's interaction with Abraham, and not even with the entire family, because after all, Terah, Abraham's father, isn't really part of the story, so much so that Terah, as we've spoken about before, sort of gets written out. That is, it's Terah that completes half the journey to Israel with Abraham in tow at the end of chapter 11, but we always think of Abraham as doing it entirely by himself. So then God's interaction is with a family. And a couple of reasons why that is before we get to the dynamics of the family, which is what I really want to talk about. One reason is that the educational model of the Torah is to use an educational model, by which I mean it's not, look, here is the way everyone should behave, but it's everybody pay attention to this student in the class. When you see how this student behaves, then you'll know how to behave as well. So Abraham and Sarah are the exemplary students in the class, and the people who follow them and then everybody's supposed to behave as they do, although they don't always behave as they're supposed to. But that's also true of exemplary students in the class. So that's one reason why you deal with a family. The other reason that you deal with a family is it is the single universal human experience. Everyone has a family. Even if they don't know their family, they have a family. And this, I don't know if you saw the most amazing story in the New York Times about this 53-year-old woman who, through 23andMe, discovered that her family was not her family, and in fact, she was abducted as a 1-year-old, and her parents had spent their entire lives looking for her, and they found her. And then she had a reunion at 53 with her parents, which was just, I mean, it was an amazing story. It was yesterday, I think, in the New York Times. And the idea that everyone has a family, and most people, obviously, the overwhelming human experience is that you end up growing up in the family that you know. It obviously isn't always true, but it is overwhelmingly true. Means that if you want to depict the norm of human experience such that people can learn from it, then you want to depict a family. And the third reason why I think the family is chosen, apart from all the other pragmatic reasons, is that every human emotion and every human sin is also found inside families. Anger, distance, murder. I mean, it starts off with a murder inside a family. Love, worry, guilt, loss, everything that exists in the world also exists inside families. And so if you want to teach people about the human experience, you don't have to be Shakespearean. You don't have to do kings and princes. You can do parents and children and siblings. And that's one of the reasons I think why siblings play such a big role here, is because siblings play such a big role in families. Even though we tend to focus on parents and children, the truth is that those families that have siblings, and also those families that don't have siblings, the absence of a sibling also plays a huge role. Like, only children are affected sometimes as profoundly by the absence of a sibling as those who have siblings are by their brothers and sisters. And also, just as a little bit of an aside, years ago, I read a book by a woman named Judith Rich Harris. I don't remember anything about the book. I can tell you what it was about. It was about how your peers affect you more than your parents. Okay? I don't remember any other thing about the book except for one startling fact that we all know, but I'd never noticed before. She said, if you want to know how much more your peers influence you than your parents, just note the fact that children of immigrants learn the language from their parents, like we all do, right? I learned English from my parents, but they don't have accents because they speak like their peers, not like their parents. And that's because evolutionarily, you have to be successful with your peers. You have to be successful with people who are the same age. You don't have to be successful with the previous generation, except for a short time. But then, if you're popular in school, that's what's going to count, right? So you need to be successful. So people tend to dress like their peers, listen to the music of their peers, speak like their peers, on and on and on. And that's why siblings are so important, and that's why this generation is just no good anymore, because they're not like us, and we did it all right, and of course they're getting it all wrong. But they'll see, they'll find out. Okay, so anyway, those are some of the general reasons why family matters, and then I want to make some specific comments about the family that we're dealing with, and then I'll open it up for questions or comments. So the first dynamic is, of course, the dynamic of fertility, which is still an issue, but in the ancient world was a much greater issue, in part because children were economically, we're in a world in which children are an economic drain. In the ancient world, children were an economic advantage, right? You had lots of children because they used to work in the fields. And that's why people used to have 10 children and now they have 2, right? Because every child costs you, whereas every child used to ultimately benefit you. You would marry your daughters for money. You would work your sons for work. And so some of you know that I've spoken before about this wonderful, really, I can't recommend it strongly enough, this wonderful book written by Danny Abede called From Africa to Zion, about the the first Ethiopian who became a journalist in Israel. And he's one of 10 children, I believe. And he has 4 children. And his father was like incredulous. Like, you have no kids. He said to him literally, you have no kids, because he only has 4. And the world that he grew up in, by the way, he says himself in the book, it wasn't a medieval world. It was an ancient world. When he read the Bible as a kid, as a Jew in Ethiopia growing up, that was his world. He completely identified with the people in the Bible. It was no different than the world that he lived in. He was a shepherd when he was a little boy, and so were all the other little boys that he knew. And when he read about shepherds here, it was just like reading the family diary, which is amazing to consider. Then at the end of I'm not ruining anything. It's not like that kind of story, but at the end of the book, he brings his children back to see where he grew up, and they can't believe it because they grew up in Israel. By the way, if you didn't see it, speaking of Israel, as long as I posted this morning, the 5th safest country for tourists to visit in the world, according to an Swiss insurance company. Okay? I just want to get that out there on the YouTube. The 5th safer than America for tourists to visit. Okay. So the first is fertility, and obviously fertility and the drama of fertility play a big role in the Jewish nation, and it sets you up for this is going to be a small people. Because Abraham doesn't have 20 kids, as he could. You know, after Sarah dies, he has a whole bunch of kids that don't count, in quotes. Like, they don't mean anything to the history of Israel. But it sets you up for Israel is going to be a small people, and it starts off with this problem of reproducing, basically. And then there is already at the beginning, there is the tension between what the different partners want out of the marriage. Yes, they both want children, but Sarah is the one, remember, who pushes Hagar on Abraham, because they read the world differently. And causes all sorts of problems, not only presumably between them, but also in the actual event that Hagar has a kid, and that doesn't work out so well. And the same difference of goal and nature that you see between husband and wife happens between siblings themselves. Isaac and Ishmael are clearly different. And even though there isn't any overt hostility between them, the fact that they grow up with different mothers in different circumstances makes them, in some sense, essentially estranged. I mean, they come back together, if you remember, to bury Abraham in the end, but they're not, but they don't have any, there's no brotherly, like, sense of the two of them. And their interaction is far less than we get with Jacob and Esau, which we'll come to in just a minute. And then you get the also in the family, the fact that generations have different destinies and different characters, because Isaac is profoundly different in portrayal from Abraham. And I'll give you 3 different interpretations of that. One is, if you're a biblical critic, there was an Isaac scroll that was lost, because it's striking how little there is about Isaac compared to how much there is about Abraham and Jacob. And if you want to be a biblical critic, geh gesundheit, go and be healthy. who knows? But as we have the Torah, the principal difference of Isaac and Abraham is like the founder of the company and the one who wants to make sure the company doesn't go under, right? That's the son. He doesn't expand the franchise. And in fact, everything about Isaac is in some way about both renewal and limitation. So he's the one who stays within the borders of the land of Israel. He never goes outside of Israel. He's the only one. Jacob does, Joseph does, Abraham does, Isaac doesn't. He redigs the wells that his father had dug. That's renewal, right? And he passes on the blessing to the right child, even though he doesn't necessarily do it willingly. But all of that is basically limitation and renewal. And again, since we're on this Israel kick, and since I think I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again, this is an Israel talking point that Israel advocates don't use nearly enough. And most of them they use enough, so they should use this one too, which is the fact that God said, this land is yours. Whatever the borders of the land are, you can argue it endlessly. But you realize that that does mean what is outside of these borders is not yours. That is, it's an anti-imperialist statement. Because when the two tribes, the 2.5 tribes, Reuven, Gad, and Chatzi Menashe, when they say we're going to stay on the other side of the Jordan, Moses never says, okay, we'll conquer that too, and that'll be ours also. No. The whole point is that's not ours. That belongs to someone else. And as soon as you say, this is mine, you're also saying that is not mine. When you put a fence around your property, you're saying outside this fence doesn't belong to me. And so when we say that God promised this land, it's also a statement that we don't have any claim on Lebanon, right? Lebanon doesn't belong to us. So I think that that's important, and Isaac is the one who consolidates that idea because he never goes outside the land. And also, Isaac is, along maybe you could say with Adam and Eve, Isaac is also the one who makes it clear that the husband is not necessarily the dominant one in the relationship, because it's clear that Rebecca is the dominant one in that relationship. Maurice Samuel has a great essay about Rebecca. It's called Rebecca the Manager, right? Because she's the one who arranges everything from the very beginning. She arranges everything about when she's going to leave her brother's house, and then she arranges everything about about who's going to get the blessing, and then she arranges for her kid to leave and be safe. Rebecca is like behind all the action. Isaac is acted upon, right? First by Abraham in the Akedah, when he takes him up to the mountain, and then later by Rebecca and Jacob in the birthright. And Rebecca is the active agent here. So that's also important. It's like the movie, you remember My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that great movie where they say the husband is the head, but the wife is the neck, right? So Rebecca is the neck, right? She's the one that decides which way Isaac turns his head. And then you have the example of sibling rivalry. Now the issue is, the issue is still between husband and wife, obviously, because Jacob and Rachel and Leah, that's a complicated, to say the least, that is a complicated arrangement and story. And again, there's sibling rivalry already there, implicit, even though it's not explicit between Rachel and Leah. And in fact, the Midrash makes them more cooperative than explicit. But nonetheless, Jacob and Esau himself starts out with a sibling rivalry, and there you can see the differences inside families. It's very interesting how often parents with 2 or more kids will be amazed at the differences. Sometimes kids are similar, but sometimes they are radically different from the same parents. And the same upbringing and the same home, and they're just radically different. You get that with Jacob and Esau. And here the family dynamics start to become messy. That is, it's not just between 2 people, it's between multiple people, because here it's Jacob and Esau and their parents, right? And the ways in which parents start to favor children, which is a legacy, obviously, that continues with Joseph with near tragic results. And also the way that children conceive of their roles as being different from one another, and the way that they spot and take care of each other's weaknesses, which is what Jacob does with Esau when he knows, like, Esau's going to say, oh, I'm so hungry, I don't really care about the birthright. So the Jacob-Esau story and everything that follows ratchets the family dynamic up to a different level. It is the first time since Cain and Abel that we've seen murderous rage between siblings when Esau wants to kill Jacob. And of course, unlike Cain and Abel, the parents play an active role here by trying to spare one from the wrath of the other. Joseph Telushkin, many years ago, I remember his saying, it's true that in the Bible, sometimes people have multiple wives, but it never works out well. Which is true. There isn't as much multiple wifery in the Bible as you might think, although there's some of it, but it doesn't work out well, and obviously it doesn't work out so well with Jacob and Rachel and Leah, and in part because it's a constant warning against the dangers of favoritism. The reason that it doesn't work out well is that Jacob ends up favoring Joseph because Joseph is the child of his beloved wife who dies. Although he favored her even before. It seems like he favors Joseph even before she dies, but especially, of course, that adds an extra emotional power to it. And when you have that kind of favoritism in a presumably fair family, in a place that's supposed to be egalitarian, everybody's supposed to be treated the same, it's particularly painful and unbalancing. And so, again, I think it's genius, although genius might not be the right word to describe it, how the Torah shows you all the colors of human life inside the family as a preparation, in a way, for when the family becomes a people. Because the things that you see in Exodus that bedevil the Jewish people, they're all there already in embryo in Genesis in the family. People who don't have faith, don't have trust, who betray, who are scared, who favor one instead of the other, who on and on and on and on, all of it is already there. And then it gets played out in a world stage. I remember a long time ago when I was in high school, which was a long time ago, we read the book Young Man Luther by Erik Erikson. And it was the beginning of this trend of what they called psychohistory, which meant interpreting historical figures in psychological terms, which people didn't used to do when they wrote biographies. But as psychology became more, and Erik Erikson was one of the first great psychologists. He developed the theory of identity, for example. But as people became more sophisticated psychologically, they started to read people psychologically. Well, the literature was way ahead of them, right? Because all novels actually all great novels are about the inner life in part of the characters. Action novels are about what they do, but you read Tolstoy, and Tolstoy knows Anna Karenina very, 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 very well, which sounds silly, but not a novelist knows their character as well as Tolstoy knows Anna Karenina. And what you see in the Torah is anticipating all of that, because the psychology of the characters becomes the psychology of the people as well. And so if you read what happens to Jacob, you can sort of understand more deeply why Israel becomes Israel, the people now, not the individual, why Israel becomes Israel, and why they act the way they do. And even to the extent of like their willingness to betray God because they want meat is not so different from the story of Esau's willingness to give up his birthright because he wants lentil stew, right? Or for that matter, in a weird way, although not quite the same, Adam and Eve's willingness to give up paradise because they want a piece of fruit. But that's more about like the nature of the knowledge they'll get from the fruit than hunger. But the hunger thing, I mean, it continues again through, you can read the rest of the story through Genesis is kind of the template through which you read it, because everything, I mean, it's very Freudian. When you go to a therapist and they say, well, what happened to you when you were 5? And you say, well, why are you asking me because I'm 60? Their answer is, read Genesis and you'll understand Exodus. They may not answer that way, but that's the same idea, which is that the things that happen to you early are the formative things. In fact, going back to Tolstoy, since we mentioned Anna Karenina, he once said, and I think that this is true, he said, between a child of 6 and myself is not so far, but between an infant and a child of 6 is an astonishing distance, right? Those first years when you become a human being, right, those are so deeply formative. And now we know neurologically when your synapses connect and so on and so on, that the first few years are incredibly important. Okay, so all this is a way of saying that all these patterns that we see in Breshit, and even in Vayishlach this week, and I'm going to say something specifically about this week's Parsha, all of them are repeated again and again and again in the Torah and in our life. So just 3 quick patterns in Vayishlach. First, you have the rape of Dinah, which is violence / sexual violence / violent revenge. So one of the ways that human beings operate is through violence, revenge, sexual predation. All of that is contained already, again, in the family story, right at the beginning. And then you have Jacob's story. I say this all the time, but I'll say it again because it's one of my favorite bits. So remember, Jacob wrestles with the angel. The dawn is coming, and angels are like the opposite of vampires, right? Or actually the same as vampires. Excuse me. They can't apparently stay around during the day, except in the Torah when they do. But this angel can't. So he says, you have to let me go. And Jacob says, bless me. And when someone says, bless me, what do they want? Health, children, success, prosperity. What does the angel say to him? Basically, your name is no longer Seymour, your name is Fred, right? That's his blessing. But we understand that it's the blessing of self-transformation, right? That you don't have to stay what you are, that you can change. And that's also a huge theme in the Torah. And it's not a theme in a lot of ancient, we've talked about this before, a lot of ancient literature, things are fairly consistent, but in the Torah, there is the possibility of change. So you have one way of changing the world is through violence. Another way of changing the world is through self-transformation. And you get the third way of changing a world, which is that you get the reconciliation of Jacob and Esau, not in the same way necessarily that you would want reconciliation, because they don't spend that much time together afterwards, but nonetheless, all of this is another way of the Torah's portraying sort of the panoply of human life before you get to the bigger canvas of all of human life. Okay, there is more to say, and we will say more, obviously, when we come to other stories about when we come to the story of Joseph, which is what begins next week. But I just wanted to frame everything up to now by saying, and then I'll stop for questions, that the more I think about the way that the Torah portrays the life of family, the more I realize that it is not only giving us a full portrait of human life in that, but preparing us to understand everything that follows by seeing all the trials and tribulations of everything that precedes it. Okay. Let me see if we have questions. But you can ask here too, but I'm supposed to also be checking, I think, on here. So, yeah, please.
So speaking about the tension between brothers,
So there is Moses and Aaron. Remember, Aaron helps build the golden calf.
oh, yeah, okay, all right.
So they definitely, so there is a lot. I mean, not only, so Moses and Aaron actually later are really interesting because I'll just give you one really nice Moses-Aaron flip. When Pharaoh's daughter comes down to the Nile, and it says, V'hinei na'ar bocheh, and behold a child crying, right? So first of all, that probably means that Moses didn't cry out loud, because if the kid cries out loud, they're going to get killed, right, in Pharaoh's. But also, they use the word na'ar. Na'ar is not a child, right? Tinok is a baby. Na'ar is a teen. So one of the interpretations is that it was Aaron that was crying because he saw Moses being taken, which is a really beautiful, you know? But later on, yeah, and also Aaron and Miriam gossip about Moses and then have to be prayed for by Moses to be reconciled, which is like the brother who, you know, after the parents give him less of the inheritance and then the other brother blows it, so you've got to now bail out the other brother who blew the whole inheritance. Anyway, no, this is not a personal story because my parents, God bless them, left no inheritance other than lots of love and learning and so on. So there was nothing to fight about. My brothers and I joke about that all the time. And look, there was nothing to fight about, which is in some ways a huge blessing, I have to say. But I mean, I've obviously seen this many, many times, that sometimes the brother who is more responsible ends up bailing out the brother who was less responsible, or sister, who was less responsible. And that's sort of like Moses. Moses didn't gossip, they did, but then Moses has to pray to God to heal them who gossiped about him. So, yeah. Other... Yep.
Prince-ish. So, that's my first question. And the second one is about whether you view all of these then as parables.
So first of all, the Midrash does suggest, and some of the commentators, that Aaron and Miriam were jealous of Moses. I mean, Aaron's the older brother, but there's also reverse jealousy, because they don't attribute jealousy to Moses, but there's reverse wistfulness, because Moses' children don't succeed him, and Aaron's children get to succeed. I mean, those of his children who survive, right? So that's also it's also the loss of a child. The most painful human experience is portrayed both in Genesis with Joseph, because Jacob thinks he's lost Joseph, and then later in reality with Aaron, because Aaron loses two of his children. But so there is, and they're parables not in the sense that they're not true. Not taking a position on that one way or the other, but they're parables in the sense that they're clear stories that have a moral message, except that they're more complicated than parables, because parables usually have one message. And all of these, like human life, have multiple messages. In fact, I think that that's almost a test of both insight and age, is the more lessons you derive from the same incidents in your life. Like when you're a kid, you think it has one clear, but as you get older, you see almost everything, because you talk to more people and you go, oh my God, I never saw it that way. and you realize that almost nothing has, a simple bromide parallel or bromide message. And that's one, again, is one of the things that the Torah clearly helps us to understand, because the only reason I'm looking at my phone is because that's where the questions are, not because I'm like checking my email. The, the Torah helps us understand that, since commentators will give very, very different interpretations to the same idea. And I'll give you, this one is coming out this week in Off the Pulpit, but I'll give you a really nice example that has to do with the Parsha and Vayishlach. So Rambam Maimonides, right, says, all the prophets only prophesy in dreams and visions. Okay? Ramban Nachmanides comes along and says, well, if Jacob's wrestling with the angel was a dream or a vision, then why is it he walks with a limp? So obviously Rambam is not right, which you're allowed to say if you're Ramban, right? He's allowed to say Rambam is not right. Along comes a third commentator, though, the Ritva, and says, some dreams are so powerful that they forever affect your waking life. And so he reconciles the two very beautifully, right? But that's an example of how it's what is seemingly a simple parable gets, in the hands of skilled commentators, gets to be made more complicated and more interesting. Okay. Yeah, Helen. Right. That is true. There is a lot of disappointment, and it's not explicitly spoken about, which is interesting, actually. So, for example, you have to believe that Jacob is disappointed in his other children, and he sort of hints at it, but he doesn't explicitly say, you should have taken better care of your brother. How could you let him be eaten by a wild animal? But of course, he must feel that way. And I think that expectations and disappointment, which is a very powerful parent-child dynamic, happens in the Torah, but isn't, as far as I can remember, isn't named in the Torah. And the same thing with Moses. I mean, presumably, Moses, when he appoints Joshua, there must be something disappointing that he can't name his own children as the leaders of Israel. It's also, by the way, I think, a tribute to his greatness that he doesn't appoint his children, because we all know, again, that some people, even though they shouldn't, they appoint their children because they want their children to be what they're not. So, yeah, that is true. I have to give that more thought. Disappointment in the Torah. That would make a good essay. Yes. What's that? I can't hear.
Also, the way Yosef names his kids is from disappointment.
Right. Yosef names his kids basically assimilation and exactly. So yes, I think that is very true. Leah is disappointed. Leah is disappointed, first of all, that she's not chosen.
Hashem's disappointed
Right.
too.
Yes. Yeah. The phrase that their face is fallen, which the Torah does use, is a phrase of disappointment. But I do wonder, which would be really interesting to find out, which I'll have to try to find out, if there's any tracing of the emotion of disappointment in the Torah stories. Yeah. Right. A great question. So martyrdom, basically. These are all wonderful questions. So the Akedah is about martyrdom, and at least in theory, first of all, the way we learned the Akedah with Simon Greenberg of blessed memory was that the message of the Akedah is God doesn't want that. God wants equal devotion to sacrifice, but God doesn't want actual sacrifice. And in a world in which children were sacrificed all the time, I mean, we've seen, we have altars from Canaanites where they sacrifice children. What God was saying is, I'm a different kind of God. And it doesn't mean that you don't worship me with the same fervor that you worship false gods, but I don't want human life to be taken. Involuntary martyrdom, or martyrdom because you're going to be killed anyway, like Masada, for example. That throughout Jewish history has been glorified. We have to be honest about it. It has been glorified. And to die al kiddush Hashem, to die for the sanctification of God's name, is considered a very holy act. And I think that makes sense, if sense is the right word, because so many Jews were martyred that you either had to say, oh, that's terrible that they were all killed and it goes nowhere, or you could say, it's true, it's awful that they were killed, but we want you to know that your relative who was killed is also very holy as a result of the fact that he was killed. So it has been throughout Jewish history a very difficult, and sometimes people have allowed themselves to be martyred, so much so that Jewish law had to prescribe what you should be martyred for. And there are only 3 things you're supposed to be martyred for if you have a choice. Obviously, you don't have a choice. You don't have a choice. And that's idolatry, adultery, and murder. That is, if someone says, I'll kill you if you don't sleep with someone else's wife, you're supposed to say, I won't do that. Someone says, I'll kill you if you don't worship an idol, you're not supposed to do that, although some authorities say that only applies in public. If you could do it in private and you don't believe it, it's better to do it than not die. But if you're at all public so that other Jews think you really believe it, you'd rather die. And if someone says, kill that person or I'll kill you, you're supposed to say, kill me, I won't commit murder. But there's a lot of discussion about all of these, for obvious reasons, because throughout Jewish history, do you die rather than convert? Many Jews have died, but many Jews have converted. And then sometimes when Jews have converted, the Jewish community has wanted to bring them back. So it sort of nullified the conversion without much fuss, because otherwise you would lose a lot of Jews. And some people say that was one of the major motivations for the Kol Nidre prayer. It doesn't matter the promise that you made. God cancels it, and that's why it says in the prayer, God gives us the right to pray together with the sinners. Because who are the sinners? I mean, we're all sinners in this sense, but it might have meant specifically the people who converted to Christianity during the Inquisition and then came back to Judaism. So they can, yes, well. So they can justify themselves, and if they want, okay, just one second. I don't understand why exactly, but I keep getting crypto scams on my. Honestly, that is not me. I am not selling crypto. I am not selling Bitcoin. If you see my name and selling Bitcoin, I swear it isn't me. But it's nice to know that the crypto community is watching Torah class. I just want to, it doesn't seem to be helping, but I'm glad they're watching it. So, yes, I mean, suicide, first of all, I'm pleased to say that suicide bombing is not a feature of the Jewish community, although that is not to say that we have not had similar people in Jewish history who have done similar things. We have had. But it certainly has not become a major trend in Judaism. How they can justify it in other traditions, it's not for me to say. I mean, I don't know. But yeah. About the what?
The fight, the wrestling match.
You talking about between Jacob and the angel?
Yeah, yeah. Any really juicy insights? I've got some crazy
So go ahead. Tell me the theory.
theories. Okay, ready?
Yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Go ahead. I'll repeat. Right.
We read into the Parsha.
Absolutely.
And this year, I had a new chiddush. It was my Hebrew birthday on Friday night.
Okay, I hope everybody heard that, and I'm gonna, I'll first of all, I really appreciate the teaching. I would say this, sometimes. I really think so. Sometimes it is true we struggle unnecessarily, but for some people, in some parts of their life, struggle is both essential and ultimately, I think, productive. So, because that's how they overcome. And there are genuine things to struggle about in this world and to fight in this world. It depends. Trust that injustice will just take care of itself.
No.
Right. Don't you have to struggle against it?
It doesn't mean don't work for
Well, then how do you define struggle?
internal emotional conflict.
Internal emotional conflict. Okay. If you can produce a human being without internal emotional conflict, then I will be able to judge whether you're right. But since I have never met such a person and don't expect in my lifetime, maybe in yours, but not in my lifetime to meet such a person, I'm not sure. I'm suspicious. I am suspicious, but maybe, yeah. Jerry, are you such a person?
You paint a picture
That, I mean, who wrote this and how they wrote it is, I mean, I'm not, I've talked about it many times in the class, but I'm not going to go over it every time I mean, just whatever you decide you want to believe about it, if you want to believe it's human, if you want to believe it's divine, if you want to believe that there is an author to this, entirely up to you. Entirely up to you. I am just deleting, by the way, false cryptos. All I can tell you is this is the finished product we have, and this is what I and many, many, many generations have discovered in it. How it got there, I'm going to let you develop your own theories. But I also really, I don't, this is going back to the previous comment, I don't believe in a frictionless life, and I don't think we were designed for a frictionless life internally or externally. That may be a less evolved way of viewing the world, but I don't believe it. And in fact, those people who both in our tradition and elsewhere, who have claimed to not have internal conflicts, I think they got there through internal conflicts. There's a beautiful letter from Rav Hutner, beautiful letter about somebody who writes to him and says, you know, you're on such a high evolved plane and so on, and I struggle so much. And Hutner says, that's because you know me now. But you didn't know me when I was your age, and you don't know how I fought, and you don't know how I struggled, and I was just like you. And it takes work to get to where I got to. So anyway, it's worth looking up that letter. It's a really beautiful letter from a gadol, from somebody who was a great Torah scholar and from all accounts, a really remarkable human being, about being open enough and vulnerable enough to a random student who writes him to say, like, don't think that I wasn't there too. And with that, the dialogue will continue. So thank you all, and hope to see you next week for Wednesday Morning Torah. Hutner. Hutner. I will try to find the letter, and then I have it somewhere, and then if you email